Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'm the kind of guy that you can come and ask any sort of question. Well, you have a question about The Hobbit, you have the question about The Lord of the Rings, you have many questions about the Silmarillion, or the history of Middle-earth, or any of his other stories, his translations, his life, his experiences, his linguistics, all that sort of thing. I'm the guy that you can come and ask, and I've been doing this for a very long time. I mean, on YouTube, not for a very long time, but in general, for a very long time. I've been studying the works of Tolkien since I was young, in the 90s, and taking it seriously, throughout the years. So, welcome to my channel. If you have a question for me, there are several ways that you can do this. The easiest way, and sort of a quick way if you just want sort of a quick answer, is to just leave me a comment. Just leave me a comment and ask a question there, and I will answer it as soon as I am able to, as a reply to that comment. Though, if you want to be featured in a video, there are now two ways that you can do this. You can do it through the Community tab. On the Community tab, viewers can make posts, and if a viewer asks me a question there, and I deem it as a reasonable question, of course, that is a candidate to be featured in a video. I won't answer it there. I'll be answering it in the video. Or you can do it through a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question and have people with relevant experience or knowledge or wisdom or... and there's another one in there that I usually say experience, knowledge, wisdom, or... education, I guess, can answer your question about any topic. And if you ask a question on there that is about the works of, say, J.R.R. Tolkien, after you ask the question, you're going to be given a list of names of people that you could specifically direct your question at. Of course, anybody can answer any question. But my name will be on the list. It will be at or near the top of the list, actually, and you can just click on my name, and I'll get the request there, and I will consider that to be something that you want to be in a video as well. And if you like the content, please subscribe to me if you haven't already. And I'm going to ask again at the end, because if you're still a little like, well, I don't know if I like you just yet, but at the end, if you make it that far, then you certainly do want to see more. I think we're trying to, of course, drum up more engagement and keep the channel moving and getting even better. So, of course, I would ask not only to subscribe, but to like the video, hit that thumbs up button, and to leave me a comment, even if you don't have a question, even if you want to just say hi. Some people just leave emotes and such. That really helps. So, yeah. I want to do a reading for you, and today the book that I'm going to be reading from is Beren and Lúthien. This is the novelized form. Well, it's not really a novelized form. It appears to be a novelized form. But really, it's just sort of every version of Beren and Lúthien contained in one volume, edited down from thousands of pages of drafts, because this was sort of his most important, most keystone work. It was, this was really, Beren and Lúthien is not just the tale of a man and an elf who fall in love and have this grand romantic adventure, taking on the Dark Lord Morgoth and everything, but it's also the tale of J.R.R. Tolkien and his wife Edith. Not to say that it is allegorical, because it's not allegorical, but rather that he wrote it to sort of say the things that he wanted to say about his grand romance and how he felt about his wife and everything, because there has very rarely been a person, real or imagined, that was as in love with his wife as J.R.R. Tolkien was. I mean, the only thing that would come close would be a completely fictional character like Gomez Addams. Gomez Addams was incredibly in love with Morticia. So I wanted to read a little bit of, I think, the poem version of Beren and Lúthien, which is a very long poem, usually referred to as the Lay of Leithian, and I wanted to read a bit of that. This is not the earliest version of it, nor is it the last version of it. The last version of it would, of course, be what was found in the Silmarillion itself, in the chapter of Beren and Lúthien. So this version is the narrative in the Lay of Leithian to its termination. I'm going to be reading from the middle here, but I wanted to give you Christopher Tolkien's intro here. This substantial portion of the poem takes up from the last line of Canto 7 in the Lay of Lúthien, but none would yield and none would tell, and the opening of Canto 8 corresponds to the very compressed account in the Quenta of the confinement of Lúthien in Nargothrond, imposed on her by Celegorm and Curfin, and from which she was rescued by Huan, whose origin is told. A line of asterisks in the text of the lay marks the start of a further canto, Canto 9 at line 329, Canto 10 at line 619, Canto 11 at line 1009, Canto 12 at line 1301, Canto 13 at line 1603, and Canto 14, the last, at line 1939. So you can see this is a very, very long poem. And I'm actually going to start from... I'm going to start from line 1179. And this is a bit of that is very familiar to those who read the Silmarillion and the story of Beren and Lúthien, of how they, together snuck into Morgoth's palace, and she danced for the court and put him to sleep and all that. And this is the same bit. I don't think I'm going to read too much of it because, like I said, this is a very long poem, but the same bit, starting from line 1179, told as a poem. Of one fair gem thou must be thief, Morgoth or Thingol's loaf or leaf. Thou must here choose twixt love and oath, if vow to break is still thee loath. Then Lúthien must either die alone, or death with thee defy. Beside thee, marching on your fate, that hidden before you lies in wait. Hopeless the quest, but not yet mad, unless thou, Beren, run thus clad in mortal raiment, mortal hue, witless and redless death to woo. Lo, good was Felagund's device, but may be bettered, if advice of Huan ye will dare to take, and swift a hideous change will make, to forms most cursed, foul, and vile, of werewolf of the wizard's isle, of monstrous bats ever mind fell, with ghostly claw-like wings of hell. To such dark straits, alas, now brought, are ye I love, for whom I thought. No further with you can I go, whoever did a great hound know. In friendship at a werewolf's side, to Angband's grinning portal stride. Yet my heart tells then that at the gate, that there ye find 'twill be my fate, myself to see. Through to that door my feet shall bear me nevermore. Darkened is hope and dimmed my eyes, I see not clear what further lies. Yet maybe backwards leads your path, beyond all hope to Doriath, and thither perchance we three shall wend and meet again before the end. They stood and marvelled thus to hear his mighty tongue so deep and clear. Then suddenly he vanished from their sight, even as the onset of the night. His dreadful counsel then they took, and their own gracious forms forsook. And werewolf fell, and bat-like wing prepared to robe them shuddering. With elvish magic Lúthien wrought, lest raiment foul with evil fraught, to dreadful madness drive their hearts. And there she wrought with elvish arts a strong defence, a binding power, singing until the midnight's hour. Swift as the wolfish coat he wore, Beren lay slavering on the floor, red-tongued in hurry, but there lies a pain and longing in his eyes, a look of horror as he sees a bat-like form crawl to its knees, and drag its creased and creaking wings. Then howling under moon he springs, four-footed swift from stone to stone, from hill to plain, but not alone. A dark shape down the slope doth skim, and wheeling flitters over him. Ashes and dust and thirsty dune, withered and dry beneath the moon, under the cold and shifting air, sifting and sighing, bleak and bare. Of blistered stones and gasping sand, of splintered bones was built that land, over which now slinks with powdered fell and hanging tongue a shape of hell. Many parching leagues lay still before, when sickly day crept back once more. Many choking miles stretched once stretched ahead, when shivering night once more was spread, with doubtful shadow and ghostly sound that hissed and passed o'er dune and mound. A second morning in cloud and reek struggled when stumbling blind and weak, a wolfish shape came staggering forth, and reached the foothills of the north. Upon its back there folded lay a crumpled thing that blinked at day. The rocks were reared like bony teeth, and claws that grasped from open sheath. On either side the mournful road that onward led to that abode, far up within the mountain dark, with tunnels drear and portals stark. They crept within a scowling shade, and cowering darkly down them laid. Long lurked they were beside the path, and shivered, dreaming of Doriath, of laughter, music, and clean air, in fluttered leaves, birds singing fair. They woke, felt the trembling sound, the beating echo far underground, shake beneath them the rumours vast of Morgoth's forges, and aghast they heard the stamp of stony feet that shod with iron went down that street. The orcs went forth to rape and war, and Balrog captains marched before. They stirred, and under cloud and shade at eve stepped forth and no more stayed, as dark things on dark errand bent, up the long slopes in haste they went. Ever the sheer cliffs rose beside, where birds of carrion sat and cried, and chasms black and smoking yawned, whence writhing serpent shapes were spawned, until at last in that huge gloom, heavy as overhanging doom, that weighs on Thangorodrim's foot, like thunder at the mountain's root, they came as to a sombre court, walled with great towers, fort on fort, of cliffs embattled to that last plain that opens abysmal and inane before he final topless wall of Bauglir's immeasurable hall, where under looming awful waits the gigantic shadow of his gates. So, well, this ends right before they go in, and they confront Morgoth. Of course, Beren is disguised as a werewolf, and Lúthien is, she has her mantle that she uses as sort of a disguise, but also to empower her. And you can see even though it's a poem, and you would think that a poem would be less detailed than, say a narrative, prose found in the Silmarillion, but the Silmarillion is so quick. It everything goes really fast, and it's really just. And then they traveled up, and they passed by Drauglin, and they went to the gates, and they went inside, and they met Morgoth, and it becomes a little bit more detailed there. But you can see that this is sort of the much more detailed version of Beren and Lúthien. And there are prose versions of it in here. There's tons of different versions of Beren and Lúthien. I do highly recommend this book if you don't, have it, because it gives you pretty much every version that you could read. I stopped there because it was the end of that canto. I wanted to just really comment on one interesting thing, is that he uses a word here that he would not want to use at a later date here. Let's see. Here it is. I'm just going to read from line 1191, that sort of little stanza there. Lo, good was Felagund's device, but maybe bettered if advice of Huan ye will dare to take, and a swift a hideous change will make. To forms most cursed, should be cursed, foul, and vile, of werewolf of the wizard's isle, of monstrous bats ever mind fell with ghostly claw-like wings of hell. So the word that Tolkien would later want to ease off of in this instance would be wizard. Wizard's isle, referring to really necromancer's isle, to Sauron's isle. And the sort of the spawning place of the first of the werewolves and the vampires and a lot of the sort of fell creatures that Sauron created in the first stage with necromancy. But later, wizard became a very specific thing, referring to the wise, and specifically not just to the wise in general, but to the Istari. Now, Istari does mean the wise. It's just Elvish for the wise, but it refers specifically to those Maiar spirits that came from over the sea and took these forms, the 5 wizards. So he probably, he would find another way of writing it, although it could just be because wizard is, it fits in the line being, 2 syllables, because sorcerer wouldn't necessarily have the same meter. Necromancer is too long. So he would probably just, want to redo that whole part. Another thing that's interesting is while Beren and Lúthien are traveling up towards Angband here, and they're going through this horrible place, and it's just, it reeks, and it's terrible, and it's fell, and it's dark, and and they start thinking of what lays back there, like in the other direction of Doriath, and how wonderful it is. And it's interesting because Doriath in this version, Lúthien was trapped there and had to be, well, that's Nargothrond, she was trapped and had to be rescued. But to go back to her father, to Thingol, and then to not be able to marry Beren, she doesn't want that. She's going forward. Beren already tried this once and failed, and terrible things happened. And now she's coming with him, and they're really in it together at this point, which is what I say. It's like the grandest romance. They're really, really in it together. They're doing this not for the good of Middle-earth. They're doing it for each other and for their own love. The good of Middle-earth follows from that, because anything that you do from a really pure love is going to be good, and I think Tolkien believed that. Not from an obsessive sort of love, because then you get characters like Maeglin, or even like Melkor himself, like Morgoth had an obsessive love of Varda, of light, of himself, or a love of crafts could be obsessive, like Feanor or Saruman, and lead to terrible things. But a really pure love cannot be bad. I think Tolkien would agree with that, and the sort of love that he felt for his wife Edith, the sort of love that Beren feels for Lúthien. But they do start to feel a little down. They start to feel like, oh, this really is terrible. This is a really bad experience that I'm having, and they start thinking of Doriath and how wonderful that is and how nice it is to be there. And Tolkien often does this, and he really gives us the mark of true bravery. A lot of people think that bravery or courage is just to not be afraid, and that's not true. That's not true, because everybody feels fear, right? What we have with bravery or with courage is somebody who does feel fear, but overcomes it. And we see this with all of Tolkien's heroes, really. All of his heroes feel great moments of fear, and sometimes they even act out of this fear, because it's not always fear for their own well-being, but for the well-being of people that they love and they care about, and or their homes or their countries or whatever it may be. And we see this, like with Bilbo, for example. So much of the first act of The Hobbit, which at this point, I think at this point it had been written because he was working on the Quenta, so The Hobbit has been written, but the earliest versions of Beren and Lúthien predate The Hobbit, but we see a little bit of that sort of thing where Bilbo's just thinking about his armchair and the Shire. Wait, he doesn't say the Shire because that isn't mentioned, but he's thinking of his country and his land and his hold and his tea cakes and all this stuff, and how comfortable and wonderful it was to be back there, and wishing that he was, but never saying, hey, Thorin, Gandalf, you know what, I've decided this isn't for me, so I'm just gonna, I'll send you some money to, make up for what I ate and everything. I'm just going back, and it's not that Bilbo was incapable of doing that, because in the first 2 chapters, I mean, well, especially the second chapter, where they're going through a lot of rainy and dreadful sort of experience, and Bilbo is cold, and he's wet, and he's tired, and he's never really been these things. He's always lived this life of comfort, and he's thinking of home. He's not thinking of riches. He's thinking of home. And that really shows you that that's what he values. And we go to Thorin's deathbed speech, where he says if more people valued, food and song and good cheer than hoarded gold, then the world would be a better place. And Thorin didn't have a whole lot to say here because he was dying, but it's not just about, food and home and good cheer, but also just all the things that we love, not necessarily like money and wealth and power, but peace and comfort and not having big worries. You know what I mean? Like Bilbo, he didn't have like really really big worries about much until he made real friends, because he always probably could get out of whatever situation he was in. But when he started becoming close with the dwarves, then he started valuing other people in a way that you don't really get an indication that he had before. He was he had a scholarly and sort of, I would almost say, fanboyish interest in elves, which we see in the quest for Erebor. But he didn't, know elves personally. He hadn't met Elrond, for example. He hadn't been to Rivendell. But, and then later we see in The Lord of the Rings how he worries greatly about Frodo, and because, they're reunited, and Frodo has been stabbed and is deathly ill and is at death's door. And then he's thinking, oh my God, if I had given him my armor and my sword, we wouldn't be in this situation. I was supposed to leave him everything, and I gave him that cursed ring, but not my armor. And he's having this sort of moment. If I had cared more about Frodo than the armor, he wouldn't be in this situation. And so, of course, as soon as they're up and about, he gives him the armor. So it's just sort of a lot of like philosophical navel gazing on my part here, and on Tolkien's part as well. But grand romance doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of, boy meets girl sort of romantic love. In that sense, it could also be, any sort of thing. What does Bilbo love? He loves his house. He loves eating. He loves sitting outside on the porch and watching people go by. He loves peace. He loves quiet. He loves singing. He loves poetry. And these are all things that are, worth having a terrible adventure over. And they love Doriath. Beren and Lúthien, they love Doriath, and they're reminiscing about it. And this doesn't make them turn around and go home. It spurs them on. It spurs them on, because if something's not done about Morgoth, then what is to become of Doriath? What will become of Doriath? And of course we know what happens with Doriath, but there you have it. Anyway, we have 10 questions to get to, and a few of them are quite long, so I'm not going to waste any more time waxing poetic here about Beren and Lúthien and The Hobbit and the sort of themes that Tolkien has. I just wanted to go into that a little bit, because it's a topic that was on my mind. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into your first question. Our first question comes in from Randall Melgard, who asks, why did Sauron not go invisible when he put on the ring? It seems it must work better than on non-Valors. I believe the word you're looking there for is Valar, which is already plural, by the way. Vala would be the singular form, and then Valar is more than one. But that doesn't really have anything to do with the other elements of the question. What it really comes down to is that invisibility is not the function of the One Ring. The One Ring was not designed to be worn by elves or men or dwarves or hobbits. It was designed to be worn by one person and one person only, which is Sauron. So anything that happens to a person when they wear the ring is a byproduct, not what it was designed to do. The One Ring isn't a tool to become invisible. That would actually be very silly for Sauron to make, because he's already invisible by his very nature. So he is what we call a Maya spirit, which is a fancy term, an elvish term for a lesser angel. Sauron is basically invisible to the children of Ilúvatar, the children of God, men and elves. They cannot perceive his form. The Maiar and the Valar as well, the Valar are the greater angels, they use something called a thana to make themselves visible. Essentially, it's a suit of clothes that functions as a body that can be perceived. if Sauron wants to be invisible, all he has to do is to take his clothes off and go unclothed. As a non-incarnate, meaning he's not bound to that body is not him. He is a full body, full being without his fauna, so he could just do that at any point that he wants, and he doesn't suffer from it. He's not diminished in any way, just like you could take off your clothes, and you're still 100% a full person. You haven't been harmed. You haven't lost anything. You're still you. Now, what happens to people when they wear the ring is that they and their immediate effects are drawn into a parallel realm that Tolkien referred to as the Wraith World. The Wraith World is not the same spiritual realm that Sauron normally occupies, but rather it is a realm of necromantic creatures, the undead. This is very on brand for Sauron's creations, as he is a necromancer. He had created vampires, he had created werewolves, he had created wraiths, and all sorts of horrible abominations. So to sum it up, Sauron, as a Maya, does not need a ring to become invisible, and as a necromancer, he doesn't need a ring to be in the Wraith World. The purpose of the One Ring is the domination of others, not invisibility. Isildur tried to master the ring and use it for its intended purpose, but he was too good and not strong enough to do so, and the ring wound up fighting back against him and gave him pain. The subsequent bearers, Deagol, Smeagol, Bilbo, and such, and Frodo, they only wore the ring. They didn't tap into its real power or even try to tap into its real power. So it was for the longest time really just assumed by many to be just this magic ring. I shouldn't say many, because not many people knew about it, but whoever knew about it, they thought it was just a magic ring that makes you invisible. And as a casual reader who might just be coming off of The Hobbit and just starting The Lord of the Rings, you might not understand that, or maybe you watch the films and you don't understand, well, Sauron's wearing the ring, he's fully visible, but, when somebody else puts it on, they disappear. And they didn't really have a lot of time in the films to really go into all that lore, so you're just supposed to understand that it's because it's Sauron's ring, and it only does that to other people because he never really thought about what would happen if somebody else wore it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Tomislav, who asks, what do you think of the criticism that too many of the principal characters survive in The Lord of the Rings, and therefore it is not a good representation of the horrors of war? So it isn't meant to be a good representation of the horrors of war. So there's that to start off with. If you want that, there's plenty of stories like that in the Silmarillion, for example. It's also a bit more realistic. The Lord of the Rings is also a bit more realistic than people really think. Many of the so-called primary characters are leaders and kings, and they usually don't get killed in battle. Of course, there are exceptions. We see it with Theoden. We see it with Dain the Second Ironfoot. We see it with Brand. And we can extend this as well to Boromir, the son of a steward who dies. But people who are too accustomed to the films forget that there's a lot of characters out there that were left out or were neglected. There's Hama. He did die in the films, but most people sort of forget about him. There's Halbarad, who was completely left out of the films. There's Beachbone, who was in the film, but he survived in the film. There's Lotho Sackville Baggins, who was left out. Of course, you also could just ignore that there are a lot of really major characters that do die aside from this. There's Gandalf, for example. Gandalf does return because he's an angel after all, but he still actually did die, and it was shocking for those of us who were really young when we read The Hobbit and then, read The Fellowship of the Ring, and then halfway through they just kill off Gandalf. And let's not forget that the backstory includes the death of Elendil, Anarion, Isildur, and a very grisly description of the death of Horani and Gil-galad. Gollum's backstory involves him committing murder right away, and Gollum is a really major character who is even a protagonist for a brief period, and he dies. Saruman is murdered right after Frodo calls for mercy. He stopping the sort of summary execution that Tolkien would consider a war crime, but then has his throat cut by his own servant, who was then summarily executed, really for not a great reason, in something that Tolkien was meant you to understand that this was sort of detestable. The fact is that so many of the people who die are foot soldiers whose names we don't know, just like in real life. The primary characters are the ones telling the story, and they survive because they're the ones who survive to tell the story. But the heart of the matter is that The Lord of the Rings is not there to depict the horrors of war. It's there to be a fantasy story. When you start focusing on realism, you've lost the plot of what fantasy is meant to be. That's not to say that it's not touched on. Hirgon of Gondor was not an important character. He wasn't even really a foot soldier. He was a runner. He was a messenger. He brought the message to Rohan that Gondor needed aid, and then he was found with his head lopped off by orcs. The deaths are all mourned. Even Theoden's horse gets his own grave and epitaph. If you want to read about the horrors of war, read The Children of Húrin, for example, or read, any of his books that start with the Fall of Gondolin, Fall of Númenor, or even the grisly parts of Beren and Lúthien. But don't try to say that The Lord of the Rings is not doing something that it's not setting out to do. That's just silly. And I know you're not saying that. You're asking my opinion of people who say that. So I get that as well. All right, let's move on to the next question. So our next question was actually the first question to be submitted right here on YouTube using the new community tab feature where viewers can leave community posts. And this comes in by the request of No PhD Coyote, who asks, were the Nazgûl in more danger than they realized on Weathertop? Were all of the Hobbit's weapons given to them by Tom the same as Merry's? I think Frodo's sword broke when the Witch King put his full malice toward him. So I do think there was some danger there for the Nazgûl, especially considering that Frodo did directly attack the Witch King by striking at his feet. His barrow blade, which is indeed the same kind as Merry's, is what he used, and all of those barrow blades were the same. And I think Tom realized that one of these hobbits was really going to need it. He just wasn't sure which hobbit, so he gave them all barrow blades. The Nazgûl did not mind retreating. We talked about this not too long ago. Frodo was struck by a Morgul blade, and they believed that he was essentially doomed. They only attacked openly again once it was made clear that he had a real shot at reaching Rivendell. The Witch King had been taken by surprise as Frodo attacked instead of cowering in fear, which is what most people do, and even invoked the name of Elbereth, which is Varda, which Aragorn described as more damaging to the Nazgûl than the sword. Upon their next confrontation, the Witch King, who we must not forget is a sorcerer himself, used a spell to do two things. One is that Frodo was, in Tolkien's words, struck dumb. He was unable to continue speaking and using words like Elbereth that were anathema to the Nazgûl, and he broke the Hobbit's sword. He likely would have done the same to Merry, if not for the fact that Merry got him from behind, and he was focused in that scene wholly on Éowyn. So to directly answer the first question, I think that they realized the danger rather quickly, and they acted accordingly. They gave Frodo the Morgul wound, and then they got out of there before they could be harmed in any way, and then observed from a distance while tracking Frodo to see when he would finally succumb. They panicked when they realized that Frodo might slip from their grasp, and they attacked, and the Witch King even took measures to deprive Frodo of his sword and his ability to speak in the moment, but, of course, a coordinated attack by Elrond and Gandalf and Glorfindel took them out of the game for a good long while, actually. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question was also submitted through YouTube, and it was by Time Lord Victorious, who asks, been reading the Silmarillion, very interested in the character of Eöl. Why was he called the Dark Elf? Was it because he loved making swords like dwarves? Seems Tolkien said he was evil before he attacked Gondolin. Eöl's epithet, the Dark Elf, is only explained as him having an affinity for darkness. But the idea of it being connected to a deeper evil, and his crafts as well, which you mentioned, making swords and being kind of like a dwarf, was an idea that Tolkien actually had at one point. So you're really not far off there. Eöl was alternatively called the Dark Elf and a Dark Elf in differing texts throughout the years. The eventual idea that he disliked sunlight and he loved the night, this is not all that unusual for elves, especially those of the elder days, as they were first awakened in the darkness of Middle-earth before the sun, and they love the nighttime and they love the stars. He was also said to have excellent night vision, according to the book The Nature of Middle-earth, which contains some of Tolkien's most organized and finalized thoughts on elvish nature. There are dark elves, in quotes, dark elves in the legendarium. They're referred to as the Morquendi, which means elves of the darkness. That's in Quenya, or in Sindarin it would be Morithel. They are referred to as elves that did not see the light of the two trees at a point when they had the option to see the light of the two trees. This would include all of the Avari elves, as well as any Teleri who did not make it to the Undying Lands. They did not like this term. They felt they were not dark, and they preferred a different term. They like to call themselves the Umanyar, which just means that not from Aemon, and they referred to the so-called light elves as, or who were normally called the Calaquendi, as Aemanyar, which means they are from Aemon. So I'm going to shift to a different book, The War of the Jewels here. Tolkien had a different idea at one point regarding the elves taken by Melkor and tormented. He had played with this sort of idea that they became the earliest orcs, though later he didn't care for that idea, and the Silmarillion is actually very vague about it, stating that some elves believe this to be the case. However, as he abandoned the idea of the tormented elves becoming orcs, he briefly played with the idea that Melkor just corrupted them and then unleashed them to sort of be these sleeper agents that would cause mischief among the elves. Here is his note on the subject. Another name from Prim FG, meaningless then and now. But it was not intended to have any meaning in Q or S, for Eöl was said to be a dark elf, a term then applied to any elves who had not been willing to leave Middle-earth, and were then, before the history and geography had been organized, imagined as wandering about and often ill-disposed towards the light elves. But it was also sometimes applied to elves captured by Morgoth and enslaved, and then released to do mischief among the elves. I think this latter idea should be taken up. It would explain much about Eöl and his smithcraft. I think the name might stay. It isn't really absolutely necessary that names should be significant. So a note, when he says Prim FG, I was just sort of reading it as it was written because it really was just a note that he wrote. That is the primitive version of the Fall of Gondolin, and Q or S is Quenya or Sindarin. So Tolkien had this idea and thought that, hey, this is pretty good. This will explain a whole lot about Eöl and his personality. And Christopher Tolkien explains that his father's idea led to a later abandoned history of Eöl, which is then, reproduced in the book The War of the Jewels. Eöl's crafts were meant to be showing that he was more akin to the dwarves than to his fellow Sindar Elves, and he had absolutely no love of the Ñoldor. He basically blamed them for all of the troubles in Beleriand for making war against Melkor, while Tolkien eventually settled on the Dark Elf, referring to both the fact that he was Sindar and that his night vision was good and that he disliked the sun. He did indeed have the idea at one point that Eöl was corrupted and that it played into his, in Tolkien's words, his insidious craft. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in anonymously, and here it is. What was a core misjudgment in Sauron's understanding of Middle-earth's peoples that repeatedly undermined his ultimate plans? A good question, I think, and this is one that, you could take a lot of different angles towards this, because you're asking for a core misjudgment, not every core misjudgment, and he had several. I'm going to focus on one here. Sauron's estimation of the people and how they work led to some of his greatest triumphs, but also his ultimate downfall. Sauron basically categorized people into two groups, those that he could control and those that he could destroy. He didn't give any thought to people beyond this. Those who he could control were largely wicked, but not completely so. Sometimes the flaws that they had were simply not just wickedness, but rather a weakness or will of spirit or cowardice or desire for power. This is a lesson that we saw applied with the disposition of 16 rings of power. Failing to conquer the elves through this subterfuge, he tried it with dwarves and men. 7 dwarves, 9 men. Tolkien never specified an exact time frame, but I've always believed that he must have tried it with the dwarves first. And the reason I believe this is because he made a key miscalculation with the dwarves, or I should say he made 2 key miscalculations with the dwarves. The first is that he assumed the rings would work on them the way that they were designed to work on elves. Elves are the children of Ilúvatar by design, but dwarves are essentially the adopted children. They were not made by God. They were made by an angel who went a little rogue, and then he got God's blessing after the fact. That being said, they were not made the same way, and therefore the same magic that would affect an elf may either affect a dwarf in a different way or just not at all. In this case, the rings were said to corrupt the dwarves to a certain extent. They amplified their more negative personality traits, and this was tragic to their culture, as they were exclusively given to politically important dwarves, but the dwarf lords didn't become his thralls. Their will turned more towards avarice, but it was still their own will, not the will of Sauron. He failed at controlling them. The second miscalculation regarding the dwarves is that Sauron only cared about their position in dwarf society and not their character. We see that good characters with sufficient strength of character can resist even the One Ring's corruption for a long time. Bilbo is a prime example. He became more deceptive, but he never outright became evil. Frodo succumbed to the ring, but only at the place where the power of the One Ring was at its greatest, and after he had been beaten down physically and emotionally and spiritually by his journey. But he still did the impossible and got the ring to Sammath Naur, and he didn't actually become evil. He only just wished to keep the ring. So he might not have been able to throw in the ring himself, but he still did an impossible sort of miraculous feat. Character is usually important in how people react to these sorts of artifacts, and not just rings of power, but even artifacts not created to be evil, like the Palantry. Saruman and Denethor are driven mad, but Aragorn is only made greater by a Palantir. So, seeing these miscalculations regarding the dwarves, it's my estimation that, doling them out to men was a later choice and a very educated choice. Sauron learned from his mistakes. He chose beings that were like the elves in that they were children of Ilúvatar. They were just mortal. And he chose men that were already like him, or his servants, wicked tyrants, bullies, people that crave power and more life, which he gave to them in exchange for their free will. So that being said, we can see that Sauron can understand how people work, and he can make informed decisions that could lead to very real victories for him. Another example, choosing to surrender to Pharazôn got him a free ticket to Númenor, and then using flattery and the king's own personality flaws against him, he manipulated an already fallen people into falling so far that God himself wiped them off the map. He did not account for a number of the faithful escaping to Middle-earth, however. His enemy still being around after such a display really bothered Sauron. The existence of Gondor and Arnor were affronts to him. Númenor was supposed to be gone, and not only did a remnant of their culture survive, but it was the part of their culture that he could never control, and he had failed to stamp them out. They would never be his vassals. They would only ever be his enemies. Sauron thought of people as being either the ones who were either sufficiently evil enough to willingly join him, or weak enough to be controlled by him, and those strong enough to resist him that he could stamp out through sheer might. Of course, he lost the war in the Second Age, but he would return when they diminished, and he would try again. But there's a type of person that he didn't account for, those who have no interest in power. The two types that Sauron thinks about are defined by what would they do with the power that he assumes that all people crave. They would either be the type to stamp out, like Aragorn, or the type that he could use his talents to drive insane, like Denethor. He didn't really think of a person who could hold the most powerful artifact in Middle-earth in his hand, and to be made to understand what it is and what it is capable of, and still wish to destroy it. And I'm talking, of course, about Frodo here. But it applies to more than just Frodo. Like Faramir is a great example. Faramir didn't know that the One Ring was basically right in front of him, and he found himself saying that if he found such a thing lying on the side of the road, he would not touch it, not even to attempt to keep it out of evil hands, because he knows that it can't do good things, and he knows it would corrupt him. Frodo is even told by Galadriel exactly how the ring works and what he would have to do to use it. And he still makes the conscious choice to walk into Mordor and get rid of it for good. Sauron just can't conceive of such a thing. He doesn't think that way. He, of course, never thought his ruling ring would fall into the hands of his enemy, but he did think at one point that if the elves got their hands on it, that they would destroy it. So he did conceive that there are people out there who would wish to destroy the One Ring. So what changed his mind? What was the spanner in the works that essentially broke Sauron's logic? It was Gollum, of course. Gollum was a being completely consumed by the One Ring. Sauron came to the conclusion that even if a person did not understand what the ring was or what it was for, they would become obsessed with it. And there is some truth to this. Even Frodo was devastated by its destruction. He didn't get to make the conscious decision to throw it in, and having it ripped from him was more traumatic than losing his finger. But he underestimated, and I mean Sauron underestimated how good people could be. Frodo was, in his own unique way, stronger than Sauron. If Sauron came to to have some incredibly powerful artifact that belonged to, say, Manwë, for example, that could not be used for evil but only for good, he wouldn't easily give up trying to find a way to profane it for his use. And if he did give that up, he wouldn't destroy it so that Manwë could never use it against him. He would want to keep it safe. In other words, his mentality would be more like Boromir than like Frodo. Tolkien had a really important theme in his work, and it's that downfalls come from valuing objects over people. I touched on this a little bit in the intro. We see it with Faramir, with Sauron. Faramir. Forget that. We don't see it with Faramir at all. He's the opposite. We see it with Feanor. We see it with Saruman. We see it with Sauron. Sauron made this silly choice to let Gollum live, to cut him loose. He thought that this may lead him to the One Ring instead of just accepting that it was lost. If he'd accepted that it was lost, we need not even come to the point where Frodo can't throw the ring in the fire. He wouldn't have even made it past the Dead Marshes. He didn't even consider the fact that if Gollum did get the ring, he would just vanish. He would never be found. He would find a deep, dark hole, and he would stay in it for centuries. He just thought that he could use the creature as sort of a dowsing rod, placing him into the someone I can control or utilize category, which is actually a shockingly ignorant thought, considering that it was Gollum's indomitable will that shocked him to his core. He quickly sussed out that he can't dominate Gollum other than by destroying him, yet he still made the choice to not destroy him because he was so focused on the ring that he didn't even need. He could easily have won the war without it. So in conclusion, there are a lot of angles we can take this from, but it is my estimation that Sauron never accounted for exactly how good a person could be without being a king or without being a mighty hero. He never really thought of the little people like Samwise, who had the ring promise him everything and rejected it because he didn't want everything. He just wanted to have a little garden of his own to tend to. That sort of thinking was alien to Sauron. He would never think that way, and he doesn't understand why people would think that way. And that was his failure and his final downfall. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from the request of Banazir, also known as Samwise. Did the elves eat dwarves? They did hunt the Petty-Dwarves, after all, when they thought those were just animals, and most hunting is for meat. Also, did Melian just let that happen? If I recall correctly, it was specifically Sindar, who only existed during her time. The Sindar didn't only exist during her time. They existed well after her time as well. But we could go either way on this one. Oh, I guess you could say all of time is her time since she is an angel. But we can go either way on this one because Tolkien wasn't specific. I would say that it's incorrect to assume that all of the Sindar were with Melian as well. But I do think from careful examination of the text found in the War of the Jewels leads me to the conclusion that while the elves hunted the Petty-Dwarves, they were not a food source for them. So I'm going to read you a relevant bit from Tolkien's notes contained therein. The Eldar did not at first recognize these as incarnates, for they seldom caught sight of them in clear light. They only became aware of their existence indeed when they attacked the Eldar by stealth at night, or if they caught them alone in wild places. The Eldar therefore thought that they were a kind of cunning two-legged animals living in caves, and they called them Levain Tad Dale, or simply Tad Dale, and they hunted them. But after the Eldar made the acquaintance of the Naugrim, the Tad Dale were recognized as a variety of dwarves and were left alone. There were then few of them surviving, and they were very wary and too fearful to attack any elf unless their hiding places were approached too nearly. The Sindar gave them the names Nogotheg, Dwarflet, or Nogoth Niben, Petty Dwarf. So, having never seen dwarves, they thought these creatures were animals of some sort. They did not at first recognize them as incarnates, meaning that the elves did not think that they had souls. The names that they gave, the name became Levain Tad Dale. That's paragraph that I read doesn't tell you what that means. It doesn't gloss it. But Levain means animal, and Tad Dale means two legs, so two-legged animal, and that's their name for the Petty-Dwarves, at least at first. It is explained that the elves didn't really see the Petty-Dwarves in good light, and if they were hunting them for food, that wouldn't really make sense. Even if the lighting was bad during the hunt, it would not be so when they're brought back to be prepared as food. There wasn't a sun at this point, so it makes sense that they really didn't get a very good look at the Petty-Dwarves. One could argue, though, that even if the dwarves, were seen in good light, that they didn't really look like people, because the next paragraph goes on about how dwarves themselves did not have any love of the Petty-Dwarves, as they were descended from dwarvish outcasts who were often deformed. And the Petty-Dwarves over time became a lot smaller than regular dwarves, so they may not have looked very much like typical dwarves. This, however, it doesn't track for me personally, as being deformed was not a trait shared by all Petty-Dwarves. A lot of them were simply criminals who were driven out of dwarfish society. The four attributes that Tolkien mentions are deformed or undersized or slothful or rebellious. That being said, even though they were not seen as being part of a dwarvish society, they were still considered dwarves, and the dwarves were very unhappy at finding the elves had hunted and slain their lesser kin, who had settled in Beleriand before the elves came there. It is the next sentence that cements that they were not hunted for food, in my opinion, though. This grievance was set aside when treaties were made between the dwarves and the Sindar, in consideration of the plea that the Petty-Dwarves had never declared themselves to the Eldar, nor presented any claims to land or habitations, but had at once attacked the newcomers in darkness and ambush. So here Tolkien gives us another reason why the Eldar killed the Petty-Dwarves. They didn't see them as incarnates, but also the Petty-Dwarves attacked them in darkness and ambush. They never said, hey, this is our land, we were here first. They didn't speak at all. They just started attacking. So the hunting seemed therefore to be less about them being a food source and more about eradicating dangerous creatures that were attacking them. And a note on Melian, keep in mind that not all Sindar elves lived in Doriath, and so the Petty-Dwarves as well, they lived all over Beleriand. One of their great mansions was what would later become Nargothrond after they, fled at seeing the Ñoldor coming, perhaps assuming that the Ñoldor would hunt them as the Sindar did. The Sindar had a great connection to Doriath, and that was a very large concentration of Sindar in Doriath. But there were pockets of them all throughout Beleriand, so I wouldn't say that Melian had made any specific allowances about the hunting of Petty-Dwarves. And this, also, keep this in mind, a lot of this may have happened at a time where Melian and Thingol were sort of in their trance, and the Sindar Elves didn't even really know where they were. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in anonymously, and this is a fun question because it's asking for an opinion. Which of the Valar, excluding the most commonly discussed ones, do you find the most interesting? So I don't really know what you personally would constitute as being the most commonly discussed one. Certainly Manwë, Varda, Namo, Aule, and Melkor. Beyond that, I'm unsure where the line would actually be drawn, but if we count, those 5 as being the most commonly discussed, I would say that the most interesting is Ulmo. And the fact is, were the question just to be who is the most interesting of the Valar, without any modifiers, the answer would still be the same. I suppose the only caveat here is whether or not you consider Ulmo to be among the most discussed or not, but it is my opinion that Ulmo should be discussed more. Ulmo is very interesting for a number of reasons, which I shall list. Ulmo is one of only 3 of the Valar to be unmarried. Now, it was bound to happen because they were split between 7 women and 8 guys, but the language that Tolkien used in explaining this is very interesting. The 3 single Valar are Melkor, Nienna, and Ulmo. So Melkor absolutely wanted a spouse, and his chosen love was Varda, but she preferred his brother Manwë. Nienna is said to live alone, meaning that she just doesn't have a spouse, but Ulmo is alone. This may be that Namo finds herself, that Nienna rather finds herself just without a spouse to choose from. She certainly would have no interest in Melkor, but there's really no law or saying that Vala could only marry Vala. Ulmo, though, is just alone. He is alone, and this slight change of language seems to indicate that he prefers it this way. Now, I'm not saying that, celibacy was foisted upon Nienna. She may have chosen that for one reason or another, but Ulmo is uniquely apart from his brethren in other ways. While Nienna is uncoupled in a romantic state, she does have a family, her 2 brothers, Namo and Urmo, who are often referred to as Mandos and Lórien by the elves. Ulmo, though, has no brothers or sisters in the mind of Ilúvatar. He is a single anomaly, which is a trait unshared by any of the other Valar. Every other Valar either has a sibling or a spouse, or oftentimes both. Ulmo is apart from the Valar in another way. He did not often sit in council with them. They would often hold meetings to discuss this matter or that matter, but he just often did not show up at all unless he thought it was important. Considering where he put his attention and how his actions shaped Middle-earth, I would say that he had an exemplary eye for what really mattered, and when the Valar discussed things that he thought were unimportant, he was off attending to things that he thought were important. And Ulmo is the only Vala to commune directly with mortals in a friendly fashion. The Valar left Middle-earth long before the awakening of mortal man, or even of dwarves or elves. We hear stories of the Valar visiting Middle-earth after this. Aule, of course, does this to create the dwarves and place the fathers and mothers of the dwarves in the locations that they would later awaken in. And Oroma was the one who first discovered the elves after they awakened, and Ulmo himself pushed Tol-Eressëa across the sea for the elves to use. They pretty much, stick to the Undying Lands after that. Melkor is, of course, an exception, but his communications with mortals were not friendly. They were either his enemies, such as Hurin, or they were his servants. Ulmo, however, appeared on the shore and met Tur, the first mortal man to see the ocean. And Ulmo states that he had been waiting there for Tur for some time. Now, we may say that some mortals passing through Mandos may have had conversations with Namo on a cordial basis, but that's not something that Tolkien wrote about. It may have happened, whereas the conversation between Tur and Ulmo is a critical cornerstone of the entire legendarium. The absolute importance of his meeting is especially apparent considering that choosing a mortal as his messenger to Gondolin led to the birth of Eärendil, the death of Ancalagon the Black that turned the tide of the War of Wrath, and the subsequent births of Elrond and Elros, and therefore absolutely everything to do with Rivendell and Númenor. Even Samwise defeating Sheila by using the File of Galadriel you could track that back to the fact that some swans led a man to the sea where he met Avala. And Ulmo is also an easy answer to who knew this. Now, if we take the conceit of the author into consideration, that he didn't actually write the stories, he just translated them, and that all of the stories were written by various elves and men and hobbits, we wonder who witnessed certain things. How do we know these things happened? So Ulmo is not always the answer. Sometimes it's the eagles, but a good example would be the conversation and battle between Ungoliant and Melkor at Lambeth, or even the conversation they had in the Undying Lands, where we know that Manwë couldn't see them. Who knew that happened? How do we know what was said there? Ulmo could be the answer to that because he is present in every place that there is water, and really, where is there not water? There's deserts sometimes, but there's still water in most places. Considering that he told Tuor many things that we are not privy to in the story, and that he would relay these many things to the elves in Gondolin, a lot of the blanks in Elvish chronicles would wind up, I think, being filled out, in this manner. So in my opinion, Ulmo's the most interesting Vala, whether or not you think he's discussed enough, and it is my estimation that he ought to be discussed more. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Daniel Reese, who asks, why were the Ñoldor, or whatever was left of them, speaking Sindarin during the Second and Third Age instead of going back to Quenya? Sindarin had just become a more common language in Middle-earth, even as early as the First Age. Quenya and Sindarin, they share a common root, primitive Quendian, and the elves developed the languages separately after their culture split. They weren't even the only dialects to come out of Quendian. There was also a unique Teleran language, but Quenya and Sindarin are the most commonly spoken Elvish languages, especially as Teleri is a large blanket term that came to cover many rising cultures. When the Ñoldor came to Middle-earth, they were more comfortable with Quenya, and many were of the opinion that it was the more beautiful language. But one person who did not feel that way was Ilúthingol, the king of the Sindar. Thingol even went so far as to ban the speaking of Quenya in Doriath due to the actions of the Feanorians, though at the least he was not wholly prejudiced against the Noldor. He certainly had no issues with Galadriel. Not all of the Noldor were Feanorians, and many of them happily adopted Sindarin to be able to communicate effectively with their kin in Middle-earth. By the Third Age, the only certified Noldor really left were, Galadriel and Glorfindel, and somebody pointed out in the comments, also Gildor. He's sort of a minor character, but he does count. He is Noldor. Glorfindel was one of the non-Feanorian Noldor who lived in Gondolin and would already be fluent in Sindarin, which would be spoken by a lot of the Noldor remnant, many of which who had taken non-Noldor leaders such as Elrond and Círdan. Galadriel was Noldor, but her husband Celeborn was not, whether you believe he was Sinda or Falmar, and both are equally valid. He was a Teleri elf who spoke Sindar, and their subjects were Sylvan elves, who were also Teleri elves who would speak Sindarin. The elves of Mirkwood were Sylvan and Nandor and Sindar, and even, kingdoms of men spoke Sindarin. It was the official language of Gondor. Only Westron, which is the so-called common speech, was a more popular language in Middle-earth. Well, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Harry Pringle, who asks, why does Frodo, when he is near Minas Morgul, say, "They're calling to me," and walk towards it? I know the ring is strongly taking a hold of him right now, but why does it cause him to walk towards where the Nazgûl are and not the same in Osgiliath? So this is a movie-specific question, which is perfectly fine, as this is one of the many instances of Peter Jackson doing something that was not actually in the book, but was still accurate to the lore of the book. In the film version, Frodo feels this call and he starts walking toward Minas Morgul. This seems very odd in a vacuum, but is perfectly consistent with many of the things that had happened, including attempting to present the One Ring to the Witch King when he was at Osgiliath. And, he wasn't at Osgiliath in the book, but we're talking about the movie. And putting on the ring at Weathertop, as well as nearly putting it on when he was hiding under that tree and the Nazgûl were nearby. Once again, not in the book, but, well, it was in the Ralph Bakshi movie, and Peter Jackson paid tribute to it. Aragorn explains it in the film. The ring calls out to them and they call out to the ring. In the book, it's a little different. They're somewhat drawn to the ring, as it is a vast well of evil power. The issue is that the Nazgûl can't actually see all that well. They know that a hobbit is carrying Sauron's ring. They don't know which hobbit. Their orders are to bring the ring bearer back to Sauron alive and probably kill anybody else, so they have to identify Frodo. So to do this, the Nazgûl, who are all sorcerers, we must not forget, attempt to magically compel Frodo to put on the ring, which draws him into the Wraith world where they could see him bright as day. In the book, Frodo doesn't say that they're calling to him, as his sort of walking towards Minas Morgul. It's actually way more intense. The Witch King, who is a lot more powerful than the last time Frodo encountered him, stops his march, sensing something nearby, and the wound in Frodo's shoulder that the Witch King inflicted upon him is suddenly flaring up with intense pain. This time, though, Frodo is stronger. He manages to actually resist the spell. Even as his hand creeps towards the ring, he forces himself to find his way towards touching the phial of Galadriel instead, which is filled with the holy light of Valinor. Frodo, with the help of Galadriel and by proxy Eärendil, Fëanor, and the Valar themselves, won this little battle, but the effort makes him pass out. Sam and Gollum keep him safe, and then they get him moving once again once the Witch King has passed by. Peter Jackson really wanted you to forget about the Phial of Galadriel until it was used against Shelob, which is something that was moved to about halfway through the Return of the King instead of being at the end of the Two Towers, and it's something that was actually coming up rather soon in the narrative. So showing Frodo relying on the Phial would be sort of spoiling its use when he uses it and when Sam uses it against Shelob. Tolkien did, shortly after the Minas Morgul scene, foreshadow its use, though, with Sam recalling the tale of Beren and Lúthien and realizing that the star glass that Frodo carried was essentially a sort of a makeshift Silmaril, and that they were in the same story as Beren. So while Jackson is telling a very different version of The Lord of the Rings, this one, and this was one of the changes that he made that I think absolutely worked, and it was consistent with how things worked in the books for the most part, as well as several previous scenes. Now, you might, part of what you asked is, well, why didn't he sort of do the same thing at Osgiliath? He did. He was presenting the ring to the Witch King. He was right in front of him, and he was sort of holding it up. The question then really becomes, why didn't the Witch King react to that and take the ring? But of course, I answered that in a previous episode. So anyway, let's move on to the last question. Our final question comes in by the request of Andrew Banyai, who asks, given the Istari's mission, how realistic is it for Gandalf to largely ignore Bilbo's discovery of a ring of power that deposits him into the Shadow Realm? He laments his carelessness aloud, but his lack of investigation seems too much to accept. So this is one of those situations where I have to not only tap the sign, but slam it down. It reads, viewer knowledge is not character knowledge. Now, before I pull this all apart like slow roasted pork, let me just first mention the word Istari is already plural. The singular form of that is Istar. So put that out of the way. What? There are things that the reader or viewer knows. This is what's known as reader knowledge or viewer knowledge. It's not, character knowledge. We know that Bilbo's ring was a ring of power. We know that Bilbo's ring deposited him into the Wraith world, not the Shadow Realm. Neither of these things are things that Gandalf knows in the moment. If he knew those things right away, he would have behaved very differently. He knows that Bilbo says he is invisible when he puts on the ring, but he doesn't know that this is a consequence of using the One Ring. It should be mentioned that no one ever put on the ring in front of Gandalf. The closest that anyone came was Bilbo taking off the ring as he walked into the clearing in a scene really just after he got the ring and escaped from the mountains, and Gandalf was busy yelling at Thorin at this point. So let's examine the sequence of events from Gandalf's perspective, and only with knowledge that we know that Gandalf has. First, Bilbo emerges from the Misty Mountains and sneaks past Beihl. He attributes this to just being really quiet and moving slowly, a thing that hobbits are known to do, and what is the entire reason that Bilbo was brought along. Next, Bilbo is not out of sight from this point onwards. He doesn't show any oddities or vanish in any way. He is with them as they get chased by wargs, carried to the Eagle's Abode, and then to the Carrack. He spends a few days with Beorn. At the edge of Mirkwood, Gandalf leaves the party. He is not present when Bilbo reveals that he has a magic ring to the dwarves. Next, Gandalf meets Bilbo in the ruin of Dale right after he gave the Arkenstone to Bard and Thranduil. He had clearly snuck out of Erebor and he was going to sneak back in, but once again, sneaking unseen was his job, and there was no cause for suspicion. The Battle of Five Armies happens and Bilbo goes missing, but then is found perfectly visible by someone who is not Gandalf. Next, at no point in the text of The Hobbit is Gandalf actually told about the ring. We don't know when he found out about it, but the most likely moment would be when he read it in drafts of Bilbo's book. Bilbo made the claim that the ring was given to him by Gollum, a prize for winning a riddle contest. Gandalf was strong suspicions that Bilbo is not being entirely truthful, but his story remains unchanged for decades. Next, Gandalf is concerned about a magic ring. He fears that it could be the One Ring, and these fears are assuaged by Saruman, whose main shtick is people believing whatever he says. Saruman even goes so far as to tell Gandalf that the One Ring had washed down the river Anduin into the sea and was gone for good. Gandalf has no reason to disbelieve his mentor. Next, with the 3 and the 9 accounted for, and knowing the fate of most of the 7 rings, including the fact that the last known one had been taken by Sauron from Thrain II, and with Saruman's assurances that the One Ring was lost forever, Gandalf comes to the conclusion that Bilbo has a lesser ring. Next, Gandalf's fears arise anew when 2 things happen. The first is that he notices that Bilbo has not aged in many years. The other is that Bilbo finally admits that the story and how he received the One Ring, including the way that Gollum was portrayed, were fabrications. He admits that he just found the ring lying on the ground and that Gollum was malicious. Gandalf reasons that Bilbo's youthful look is not unusual, as he is a descendant of the Took family, which have longer than average lives. However, Bilbo lying for years and making Gollum seem better in his lie is strange, especially that finding the ring on the floor was not exactly a nefarious deed that needed to be covered up. However, at this point in the chronology, Sauron is openly making war in the south, and Gandalf's attention is split between many different issues, including his actual purpose of bringing the peoples of Middle-earth together against Sauron. Next, Gandalf convinces Bilbo to give the ring to Frodo, but his behavior during this scene and how it affects him and how difficult it was for Gandalf to do, which he later described as the most difficult thing that he ever had to do in all of his time in Middle-earth, raises the alarm level to red alert. He tells Frodo not to use the ring and now makes it his business to research it. Next, there is a lot of travel involved. This was before he had Shadowfax. And as I mentioned earlier, Gandalf is spinning a lot of plates. Some of the parties that hold records are a bit obstructionist, like Denethor II, who doesn't trust him. He eventually finds Isildur's account of the One Ring, and as well as the lore of Rivendell and Gondor, but most importantly, the description that all of the rings of power were adorned with gems, with the One Ring being the only one that is bare. This happened over a period of years, as is normal for someone who had to jet all over Middle-earth, dealing with multiple issues. This also includes the entire hunt for Gollum, tracking him from the Misty Mountains to Dale, and then back nearly to the Shire, and then all the way south to Mordor, and then he's lost. And then Gandalf has to travel back to the north to recruit Aragorn, and then Aragorn has to travel to the south and track and capture Gollum, and then they have him interrogated by Gandalf and then deposited in Mirkwood. He then has to travel back to the Shire to test the ring. Next, This isn't necessarily under the scope of the question, but it should be mentioned that Frodo and the ring are still not Gandalf's only concern. There is still a war raging in the south, and he has to deal with a lot of different things. When he gets news of how dire things are, he wants to immediately escort Frodo out of the Shire, but he falls into a trap devised by Saruman. So, considering the size of Middle-earth and how much traveling Gandalf is doing, plus weighing what he knows versus what we know, especially those of us, not reading the book for the very first time, it is important to not imprint what we know onto the characters, and it is even more important to remember what Gandalf's purpose was, bringing people together to fight evil, which he was very concerned with. Also, considering he had precious little help. Saruman was working against him, and 2 of the other wizards were missing. Travel times are a real thing, especially at a time when Gandalf doesn't have the magic horse that is the fastest beast in all of Middle-earth yet. So I think I put this to bed, and just to share one of the comments here from Emma Jones. She just said, "Well, that settles that." That was a Quora comment, of course. But anyway, that's been our last question. I greatly enjoyed doing this episode, and I'm feeling a little stuffed up right now all of a sudden, which I think is related to... I dusted in here earlier, so I may have kicked up a lot of dust. So I probably should have waited till after doing the video to do that. But I'm feeling a little stuffed up all of a sudden. There was one question where I was really... it was the one about... The Sindar. I was really fighting a sneeze the whole time. But of course, then as soon as I was able, I stopped recording and I was able to sneeze. Then I didn't, and that's just how it works. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video as much as I did, or perhaps maybe even a little bit more. And if you've made it all the way through the video and you haven't subscribed already, here's where I ask you: please subscribe to the channel if you are not subscribed. If you are subscribed, just make sure you are, because sometimes YouTube will randomly unsubscribe people. And when you subscribe, make sure that you do the bell and turn on notifications and all the bells and whistles and hoops that you have to jump through. And if you want to support me in an even bigger way, consider membership. Membership does not cost a whole lot. It is only $5 a month, and you get a lot. You get to see all of the videos early, and some of them only a week early, which is honestly quite a lot, and you get to see some of them way earlier than that. And that could be really cool. And, I know YouTube actually encourages me to make some videos that are members only, but I don't like to do that. I like to give everybody the chance to see the videos and not just make videos for members. So I just have it for a period of time. They're for members only, and members just get to see them early. I'm not trying to sort of extort you and saying, you don't get to see this video at all unless you join. But I will ask that if you enjoy my work, and that a lot of research, a lot of reading goes into this, and also I do pour money into this, to just maybe give a little bit back if you can and if you feel comfortable doing so. And you get some emotes and you get a cool little badge on your profile picture and all that stuff. So anyway, guys, we'll see you guys next week. Send me some questions either in the comments or on Quora or in the community tab. My Gavanen.